Core PCE is running at 2.8%. CPI is at 2.7. Unemployment is 4.4. Payroll growth in 2025 averaged about 49,000 jobs a month. And December printed 50,000. Meanwhile, the Fed's target range is still 3.5 to 3.75%. That set of numbers shouldn't coexist, because an economy that's still growing can hold inflation above target. But an economy creating 49,000 jobs a month usually can't stay fine for long. One side says soft landing. The other side says late cycle. Pricing says what words won't. So I did something simple and kind of brutal. I lined up 10 years of Fed decisions, hikes, pauses, cuts, and I matched them against jobs momentum. Not vibes, not narratives, just the sequence. And across that decade, there's only one pattern that consistently shows up before a hard landing. Not the yield curve, not headlines, not sentiment. It's a jobs pattern that only appears after the Fed thinks it's safe. Picture a pilot easing off the brakes because the runway looks clear, while the plane's engine is already losing thrust. That's what this setup feels like. And in this video, the goal is not drama, it's classification. Is 2026 shaping up as a slowdown that stays contained, or a hard landing that spreads? Stay for 3 signals that separate those two outcomes, and the one sequence that, historically, does the damage. Now, before the history, lock in the present. Consumer spending rose about 0.5% in October and again in November, according to the Commerce Department. Third quarter real GDP was revised up to about 4.4% annualized. Weekly initial jobless claims just printed around 200,000. On the surface, that's stable. Translation: the economy isn't falling, it's drifting. But drift is the danger zone, because drift hides momentum loss until it's obvious. The Fed's 2% target is the scoreboard. Core PCE at 2.8 means the scoreboard still isn't clean. Yet the labour market is acting like policy has already done its job. That contradiction is where hard landings are born. Quick checkpoint: inflation is above target, rates are lower than a year ago, and job growth is at stall speed. Coming up, the one sequence that matters. Alright, now the 10-year comparison. Across the last decade, there are basically 3 labour market modes that show up around Fed pivots. Mode 1. Hot jobs, hiring is broad, quits are high, wage pressure is sticky. When the Fed tightens into that, the economy slows. But the labour market has cushioning. Mode 2. Cooling jobs, hiring narrows into a few sectors, job switching slows, but unemployment is still low. This is where the Fed starts talking about balance. Mode 3. Thin jobs. Payroll gains are small, revisions are ugly, and hiring becomes defensive. This is where a hard landing becomes possible. But only if the sequence lines up. And the sequence is the entire point. Because hard landings don't happen just because jobs weaken. They happen when jobs weaken first. And then the Fed pivots. And then jobs weaken again after the pivot. That second leg is the pattern. Think of it like a cracked dam. The first crack doesn't flood the town. The second crack does, because the structure is already compromised. So what does thin jobs actually look like in the data? It's not just 1 weak month. It's a year where total payroll growth collapses compared to the year before. And it's a labour market where layoffs stay low, but hiring disappears. That low fire, low hire state is exactly what multiple reports have described recently. And it's why the unemployment rate can look calm, while the job market feels hard. Implication: the unemployment rate can be a lagging comfort blanket. Now bring it back to today's baseline. December payrolls added 50,000. 2025 added about 584,000 total, roughly 49,000 a month on average. Unemployment is 4.4%. That's mode 3 behaviour. But here's where people get the story wrong. They see 4.4% unemployment and assume demand for labour is strong. In reality, 4.4 can exist in 2 very different worlds. World A, hiring is still decent and unemployment is low because jobs are available. World B, hiring is weak and unemployment is low because people stop switching, stop searching, or get stuck. Same headline number, different engine. Picture a crowded parking lot with only 2 exits. Nobody's crashing. But nobody's moving either. That's not healthy. That's congestion. So the question isn't, are layoffs spiking? The question is hiring recovering or staying pinned? And that's where the Fed sequence matters. Over the past decade, the soft outcomes tend to happen when the Fed eases into a labour market that still has hiring breadth. The hard outcomes tend to happen when the Fed eases after hiring has already collapsed. And the easing doesn't restart hiring. Pricing says what words won't. So what would make easing not restart hiring? There are 3 constraints that show up again and again. First, the inflation constraint. Core PCE at 2.8 means the Fed isn't cutting because victory is obvious. It's cutting because the labour market is softening and the risk balance is shifting. That's a different psychology. It's a preventive cut, not a celebration cut. Translation: policy can become less restrictive without becoming supportive. Second, the credit constraint. Even when the policy rate comes down, borrowing conditions can stay tight if lenders are cautious. That's when rate cuts feel like pushing on a string. Think of it like lowering the thermostat. But the windows are open. The system tries, but the room doesn't warm. Third, the productivity constraint. If businesses can grow output with fewer hires, especially with automation and AI investment, then growth and job creation decouple. Temosti, that can keep GDP positive while payroll growth stays weak. Implication: job creation becomes a choice, not a requirement now. Put those 3 together. Inflation above target limits how fast the Fed can ease. Credit friction limits how much easing reaches Main Street. Productivity gains reduce the need to hire. That's the triangle that can turn a soft landing narrative into a hard landing outcome. Quick recap: the danger isn't weak jobs alone. The danger is weak jobs, a Fed pivot. Then jobs weaken again. Coming up, the 3 signals that tell which path we're on. Signal 1 is the trend in unemployment relative to the pace of hiring. 4.4% unemployment with 50,000 payroll growth is not the same as 4.4 with 200,000 payroll growth. The level matters less than the direction and the speed. If payroll growth stays around stall speed, unemployment doesn't need to explode to change behaviour. It just needs to drift higher for long enough to hit confidence. Picture a slow leak in a tyre. The car drives fine until it doesn't. Signal 2 is revisions. When the labour market is healthy, revisions bounce around but don't consistently erase months. When the labour market is fragile, revisions trend negative because early estimates overstate momentum. And when revisions are negative while hiring is already thin, the second leg becomes more likely. Signal 3 is where job growth is coming from. Late cycle job growth concentrates in a few sticky categories: healthcare, social assistance, food services, while cyclicals like manufacturing, retail, and some construction soften. That composition doesn't guarantee anything, but it changes the economy's shock absorbers. Cyclical jobs are where downturns usually accelerate. Translation: concentration makes the system brittle. Now here's the key mechanism behind the second leg. The Fed cuts, financial conditions loosen a bit, markets breathe, headlines calm down. But businesses don't hire because they don't hire off headlines. They hire off demand visibility. If demand visibility is low, and productivity is high, and margins are pressured by costs, then the first response is to protect cash, not add headcount, so the jobs recovery doesn't arrive. And when the jobs recovery doesn't arrive, spending starts to rotate, not collapse in 1 week. Rotate over quarters. Higher income households keep spending longer. Lower income households pull back first. That's the K-shaped effect that multiple reports have flagged. Implication: you can have strong spending data and still have weakening labour under the surface. Now the timeline, because the calendar can test this thesis. January 27th to 28th, the Fed meets again. Markets are largely expecting a hold, so it won't be the rate that matters. It'll be the language, whether officials describe inflation as still too high or moving toward target, and whether they sound comfortable with above target inflation lasting longer. February 6th, the next unemployment report hits. If unemployment ticks up while hiring remains thin, the sequence stays intact. February 11th, CPI prints again. If inflation reaccelerates while jobs stay weak, the Fed's flexibility shrinks. And that's when the hard landing odds usually rise. And that brings us to the mid-script cliffhanger. If the next CPI runs hot, the cut path gets harder to justify. Because then the Fed faces the worst mix, inflation friction and labour softness at the same time. That's when small cracks, then big breaks. Now, to be clear, none of this says a hard landing's guaranteed. The whole point is pattern recognition, not prophecy. So what breaks the pattern in a good way? Two things usually do. One, hiring breadth returns. Payroll gains rise meaningfully above stall speed for multiple months. Not one print, a run. Two, inflation cools enough that the Fed can move policy from less restrictive to supportive without losing credibility. Translation: cuts that actually reach the real economy. If those two happen together, the second leg often doesn't show up. The landing stays soft. But if those two don't happen, then the sequence stays live. And the most important idea in this whole video is this: a Fed pivot is not the end of the cycle. It's often the middle. People treat the first cut like a green light. Historically, the labour market often treats the first cut like a lagged warning, because the cut arrives after damage is already done. Think of it like a doctor lowering a fever after the infection has spread. The fever improves, but the patient still needs recovery time. So where does that leave 2026? Right now, the dashboard is mixed. Inflation is above target but not exploding. Core PCE is 2.8. CPI is 2.7. Growth prints have been strong, with third quarter around 4.4 annualized. But the labour market is thin. 50,000 jobs in December, about 49,000 a month across the year. Unemployment at 4.4. That's a setup where the second leg is possible. And it's the only pattern across the decade that reliably maps to a hard landing outcome. Jobs weaken, the Fed pivots. Then jobs weaken again after the pivot. Pricing says what words won't, because markets can celebrate cuts while the labour engine keeps fading. So the job now is simple, not easy. Simple. Watch hiring momentum, watch revisions, watch job composition. That's it. Because if those three stabilise, the soft landing story earns credibility. If those three deteriorate while inflation stays sticky, the hard landing story becomes less of a narrative and more of a sequence. Quick scorecard before the close. Core PCE 2.8, still above target. Unemployment 4.4, stable, but drifting risk exists. Payroll trend, about 49,000 a month. Still thin, that's where the system stands today. Small cracks, then big breaks. Or a clean stabilisation that keeps the cycle contained. The next few releases don't need to be dramatic, they just need to confirm direction. And in this kind of environment, direction is everything.